Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to another edition of You and Me and Multiple Sclerosis. My name is Pam, and I've been living with multiple sclerosis for 37 years. And in that time, I've learned a lot and experienced quite a bit, and I'd like to share some of that with you today. Before we begin, I just wanted to show you one of my many sheep mugs. I started collecting sheep mugs in the 1980s, and sheep apparently were very popular then because I had, 40 different sheep mugs. Over the years, some have cracked, some have chipped, some have just kind of gone by the boards, but I still have quite a large collection. This one, I just really like the handle. It's not as useful. I mean, you gotta be careful sticking your fingers in there because they might get stuck, and that might not be a good thing for when you're carrying a hot beverage around. I enjoy using it. I'm enjoying my vanilla chai tea that I have been drinking quite a bit of lately, and it's cold and windy today, so I'm very happy to have a nice warm drink. Well, today I wanted to talk a little bit about someone who I just learned about very recently, and I've been starting to follow his work a little bit. His name is Gavin Giovannoni. Very long Italian name, but he's British. He is professor and chair of neurology at the Blizzard Institute at Barts and the London School of Medicine and Dentistry in London, United Kingdom. And he's the leader of the Neuroscience and Trauma Center there, or at least he had been up until recently. Here's the headline from the Medical Advice, which I believe is a British publication, that about a year ago, November of 2020, he was struck by a motorcycle when he was out jogging. Though he survived and thankfully did not sustain any damage to his head, he was very badly hurt, spine, pelvis. He's been doing rehab, and he had to step down from his position at the clinic, and he had to step away from his work just to focus on rehabilitation. We wish him well. I'm really, really glad that he's okay, but I have to say it's very sad that the MS community is not going to be benefiting from his expertise for a while. But I do want to show you parts of a presentation that I watched. I've watched it several times now. I keep watching it because I keep picking up things that I didn't the first or second time. It's called Smoldering Secondary Progressive Multiple Sclerosis, and so that caught my attention right away, of course, because that's the phase of the disease that I've had for quite some time. But he has some very interesting views on MS in general, and certainly on the progressive forms of MS. Now in Britain, maybe they use this in the United States, but I haven't really heard this before, but he talks about the Lublin classification of multiple sclerosis phenotypes, and a phenotype is how something appears rather than the mechanism underneath of what might actually be happening. So you may recognize this because this is how your doctor talks to you, or you may have read in the literature how MS works. You've got CIS, Clinical Isolated Syndrome, which is basically just one syndrome that may or may not be MS, and they would break that down into active or not active, and then relapsing remitting. So let's say you had one attack of optic neuritis, they would say, well, that's clinically isolated syndrome. But if you had that and then you started to develop numbness and tingling, they would say, okay, you probably have MS. And they would put you in relapsing remitting MS, which over time might be active or not active. As we know, when you're in remission, you pretty much don't seem to have anything going on. And I should point out here, it's very important to consider what the term active actually means. And this is key to what Dr. Giovannoni is trying to say here, that active is determined by your MRI activity, the lesions that you have, and your EDSS score, and I think we're all familiar with that, how well you walk, or other things that are being measured by our doctors when we go in for an appointment. And then when you move over to the progressive side, there's really two kinds of progressive, as we know. We've been told this. There's the primary kind that starts right out progressive without the relapsing remitting phase. And then the secondary progressive phase, which is usually what happens after you've had relapsing remitting for a while. But again, we talk about active versus not active. And as he says here, what is wrong with this classification system? Well, in another slide of the same presentation, Professor G, and that's what I'm going to call him because his last name is challenging, Professor G talks about something that's really kind of ignored when we're talking about active versus inactive, and that is brain atrophy, which he says occurs across all stages of the disease. So as you might be able to read on the graph there, even with clinically isolated syndrome, brain atrophy is still present at higher than normal rates. And he gave some specific examples of patients who had presented with perhaps normal or what we'd call inactive symptoms, but when looked at in the MRI, we could see that the brain volume was significantly decreased. When we're looking at different MS therapies, the different disease-modifying therapies, those tend to focus on number of relapses or how we can prevent them or halt them. But if we're looking only at relapses and brain lesions, numbers of brain lesions, and we're declaring victory, what Professor G is saying is that if we counted all victory, if we're on a medication that will reduce the number of relapses or the number of brain lesions that we see in the gadolinium contrast MRIs that we do, we are missing the boat because brain atrophy is still going on and other problems are happening. He talked about the lesions themselves, and one of the reasons for the term smoldering MS is he says that something is happening with lesions we already have. He talked about slowly enlarging lesions. And if you have those, there's some mechanism going on in there that is probably quite destructive. But we're not paying attention to that. If we're looking at the number of lesions that we see in an MRI scan and we're saying, oh, look, you have fewer lesions than you did last time, that doesn't mean necessarily that the MS is quiescent or that the medication is solving our MS problem, holding it at bay. That is a very interesting perspective, and I had not ever heard that before, that really what we need to be looking at are other factors like brain atrophy, not just counting on the lesions or even looking at EDSS scores. They may be part of the picture, but they are not telling us the whole story. In another portion of his presentation, he was having fun with us a little bit. He was talking about normal aging and the mechanisms of that. And as he says here, life is an age-related neurodegenerative disease. Actually, in speaking, he said, life is a sexually transmitted age-related neurodegenerative disease. And of course, he got a laugh from the audience. But he's making the point that there are mechanisms associated with aging and that multiple sclerosis accelerates those aging mechanisms. And they kind of work in tandem. So in other words, you get to a point with your MS, even when you have been doing pretty well for a long time, all of a sudden you start to have new disability. And that may be actually coming from the fact that you're just getting older and mechanisms of aging would have been kicking in anyway. So Professor G talked a little bit about how we ought to be focusing on some anti-aging stuff as well as all of the other therapies that we're doing. He's very interested in the remyelination work that's happening. It's showing a lot of promise. But he had a very interesting take on that too. He said that if we focus only on remyelination without rehabilitation, we will not see the results that we need to see, because as a big believer in exercise as a way of improving a person's multiple sclerosis, or at least their prognosis, he sees that remyelination is all well and fine, but it's not going to achieve the results you hope to have it achieve unless you couple that with exercise. So very interesting. I had not heard any of this before. I don't know if you've had, but I haven't. I'm just going to go ahead and play a little bit of the video of his presentation, which, by the way, I will put the link for in my description box below. I really, really strongly encourage you to watch it. If you're like me, you'll find yourself watching it multiple times because there's a number of interesting threads in there. But I do want to play just this last little bit where he concludes his case for looking at MS as smoldering MS, because what's going on beneath the surface is probably a lot more indicative of our future than what we see in the types of things that we're looking at right now.
So will the real MS show itself? So I actually think the real MS is this, and this is irrelevant. It's not irrelevant, we need to stop it, but it's not, and I think we've been completely hoodwinked. Hoodwinked by the fact that we should be focusing all our attention on relapses, okay, and MRI activity. I mean, what's happening is the smoldering MS. So I think the Lublin classification is outdated, not fit for purpose. Inactive MS is not inactive. Smoldering MS or progression-independent relapse are the preferred terms. There are pathological drivers for this, and I think there's evidence to support almost all of these on this list, and there's probably another list here I haven't put up. And the real MS is not relapse of the focal MRI, but rather smoldering disease, and the field hypothesis suggests MS is an inside-out, and I took those slides out because I thought I didn't have time. But there's a lot of data out there to suggest that there's something in the brain that's causing the disease, and our immune response to what's causing multiple sclerosis is what causes the focal MRI activity and relapses, which disappear with time.
So as I was considering everything that Professor G was saying, I was thinking about germ theory and how when it first came out, people were really dismissive of it, or, it just really didn't change how they did things because germs are not something that we see. And it was impossible for a lot of people to imagine that something we couldn't even see was causing major problems with our health. Well, doesn't it seem almost like what Professor G is proposing here is similar to that? That here we are focused so much on what we can see, what we can count, what we can measure, that we're missing what's going on beneath the surface just because it isn't really showing up on our brain scans. If he's right, it really ought to change the face of multiple sclerosis treatment and the way we view curing it, or at least making our quality of lives better for as long as possible. I think that would be wonderful. I'm all for it. So I wish him well, and I do hope that not only will he recover completely, but that he will return to some of the work that he's been doing. One good thing is we know he was part of a team so that others are carrying on the work that he's been doing. But what a wonderful spokesperson he is, and what a wonderful thought leader he has been for the MS community. I really want to see him back advocating for us again, as he's done so well up to now. Well, that's all I have for you today. I think I need to refill my tea mug, and I'm sure you have things you need to do. But thank you for spending time with me today. I look forward to seeing you again in my next video.